The first thing I became aware of was cold. Not the biting, cruel cold of winter winds or the sterile chill of a modern hospital. This was something older, deeper. It pressed against my skin like ancient stone, like the breath of centuries captured in walls that had never known sunlight. My eyelids felt heavy, weighted down by exhaustion so profound it seemed to have seeped into my bones. When I finally managed to open them, the world swam into focus slowly, reluctantly, as if reality itself was hesitant to let me return. Above me stretched a vaulted ceiling of dark stone, crisscrossed with wooden beams that looked as though they'd been hewn centuries ago. Shadows pooled in the corners where the walls met the ceiling, thick and almost liquid in their darkness. I tried to move, and my body protested with a symphony of aches that told stories I couldn't quite remember. My right arm felt particularly strange, warm in a way that contrasted sharply with the cool air surrounding me. I turned my head slowly, fighting against the stiffness in my neck, and that's when I saw her. She was sitting beside the bed. No, not sitting, perched gracefully on a high-backed wooden chair that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle. The moonlight streaming through the tall, arched windows behind her created a halo effect around her silhouette, painting her in shades of silver and shadow. At first, I thought I was still dreaming because surely no one could look like that in reality. Her skin was the color of porcelain, so pale it seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, smooth and flawless as carved marble. Long dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, partially restrained by what looked like a white cap with a red cross emblazoned on it. A nurse's cap, but styled in a way I'd never seen before, gothic and elegant. But it was her eyes that truly captured me. They were open, watching me, and they glowed with a soft crimson light, like embers from a dying fire. Not the harsh red of danger or alarm, but something gentler, warmer, almost comforting in its strangeness. Those eyes widened slightly as she noticed my awakening, and a smile began to form on her lips, full, pale lips that curved upward with unmistakable delight. "You're awake," she said, and her voice was like music played on ancient instruments, melodic and slightly accented in a way I couldn't place. There was joy in those words, genuine relief that seemed disproportionate for someone I'd never met before. Unless I had? My memories were foggy, fragmented, like trying to remember a dream after waking. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and all that emerged was a hoarse rasp. She leaned forward immediately, concern flickering across her delicate features. "Don't strain yourself," she said gently. "You've been through quite an ordeal. Here." She reached for something on a nearby table with her free hand, and that's when I realized it. Her other hand, her left hand, was holding mine. Our fingers were intertwined, her cool palm pressed against my warmer one, and the touch was so natural, so comfortable, that I'd barely registered it until that moment. How long had we been holding hands? Why were we holding hands? I looked down at our joined fingers, then back up at her face, confusion evident in my expression. A faint blush, could vampires blush? Colored her pale cheeks, and she gave a soft, melodic giggle that seemed to echo gently in the quiet room. The sound was so unexpectedly innocent, so genuinely amused, that it momentarily banished my fear. "You held my hand all night," she said, her crimson eyes dancing with gentle mischief. "Every time I tried to let go to tend to other things, you'd grip tighter, even in your sleep. It was—" She paused, and that blush deepened, visible even in the moonlit dimness. "It was rather endearing, actually." I stared at her, my mind racing to piece together how I'd ended up here. The memories came in flashes, disjointed and incomplete, like photographs scattered on a floor. I remembered running. Yes, running through a forest, the kind of ancient woods where the trees grew so thick that even during daytime, the canopy created a perpetual twilight. My heart had been hammering in my chest, my lungs burning, and behind me there had been— "Try not to think about it too hard just yet," the vampire nurse said softly, as if she could read the distress beginning to show on my face. She squeezed my hand gently, and surprisingly the gesture calmed me. "Your memories will return gradually. The shock your body endured was significant. I'm Alara, by the way. I've been caring for you for the past 3 days. 3 days." I managed to croak out, my voice barely above a whisper. 3 days unconscious? What had happened to me? Alara nodded, using her free hand to pour water from an elegant crystal pitcher into a matching glass. The pitcher looked antique, expensive, covered in intricate etchings that caught the moonlight. She brought the glass to my lips carefully, supporting my head with surprising gentleness as I drank. The water was cool and pure, with a faintly sweet taste that seemed to revive me more effectively than ordinary water should. You were found at the forest's edge, she explained as she set the glass aside. Or rather, you found us. You collapsed just outside the palace gates. The guards brought you here to the infirmary. You were suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, multiple lacerations, and... She hesitated, her crimson eyes flickering away from mine for a moment. And the early stages of a wraith curse. The word wraith sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Suddenly, more memories surged back. The creature in the forest, it hadn't been human, hadn't been animal. It had been something else entirely, a thing of shadows and malice, with eyes that burned with cold fire and fingers that ended in claws like blackened iron. It had cornered me against a ravine, and I'd felt its touch, ice-cold and burning at the same time, searing into my shoulder. Instinctively, I tried to reach for my left shoulder with my right hand, but Alara gently intercepted the movement, keeping our hands joined. It's healing, she assured me quickly. I was able to extract most of the curse before it could take root. There will be a scar, I'm afraid, but you'll suffer no lasting supernatural effects. You were very fortunate. A few more hours and... She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Where am I? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The Gothic architecture, the moonlit windows, the fact that I was being cared for by someone with crimson eyes and skin like marble, there was only one place this could be. Castle Nocturne, Alara confirmed, her voice taking on a tone of quiet pride. The Palace of the Nightborn Court. You're in the palace infirmary, specifically in one of the recovery chambers. You're safe here, I promise you. Lord Valerius himself ordered that you be given the best care possible. Safe. In a vampire palace. The irony wasn't lost on me, but as I looked at Alara's gentle expression, at the genuine concern in her luminous eyes, I found myself believing her. There was nothing predatory in her gaze, nothing that suggested I was seen as prey. She looked at me the way a dedicated healer looks at a patient. With professional concern, yes, but also with something softer, something almost protective. I don't even know how I ended up in that forest, I admitted, the frustration evident in my voice. I remember a journey traveling for research. I'm a historian, I think. Or was I an archaeologist? The uncertainty was maddening. I was looking for something, investigating old legends about. The memory slipped away before I could grasp it fully. Memory confusion is a common side effect of wraith exposure, Alara explained, her thumb absently rubbing small circles on the back of my hand. The gesture seemed unconscious, automatic, as if she'd been doing it for hours. The curse affects the mind first, trying to disorient its victims. But as your body heals, your memories should return. What's your name? Do you remember that much? I focused, digging through the fog in my mind until I found it. Marcus, I said, and the name felt right, felt like mine. Marcus Thorne. Marcus, she repeated, and the way she said it, with that melodic accent, made my name sound like something from a fairy tale. It's nice to finally know what to call you. I've been thinking of you as the mysterious human for 3 days now. She giggled again, that same soft, musical sound that seemed so at odds with every story I'd ever heard about vampires. In all the tales, all the legends I'd studied in my research. Because yes, I was beginning to remember that I was indeed a historian specializing in supernatural creatures. Vampires were depicted as cold, cruel, predatory beings. They were the monsters in the night, the aristocratic killers who viewed humans as nothing more than food sources or playthings. They certainly weren't supposed to be gentle nurses who held your hand through the night and blushed when they talked about it. Alara, I said carefully, testing out her name. Can I ask you something? Of course, she replied, tilting her head slightly in a gesture that was distinctly curious. Why are you taking care of me? I mean no offense, but I'm human and this is a vampire palace. Shouldn't I be? I trailed off, not wanting to voice the darker possibilities. Her expression grew serious, though not cold. Is that what you think of us? That we're all mindless predators? There was a hint of sadness in her voice. The Nightborn Court hasn't hunted humans for over 3 centuries, Marcus. We have treaties, agreements, systems in place. We receive donated blood from willing human partners in the nearby towns, compensation is provided, and in return we offer protection from the true dangers that lurk in these mountains, creatures like the wraith that attacked you." She shifted in her chair, and I noticed for the first time how elegant her uniform was. It wasn't the practical, sterile attire of a modern nurse, but rather a carefully tailored Gothic ensemble. A dark dress with a fitted bodice and long sleeves, accented with red trim that matched her eyes. A silver insignia over her heart depicted a crescent moon cradling a blood drop, likely the symbol of her medical order. "I'm a healer," she continued, her voice firm with conviction. "I took an oath when I completed my training 200 years ago. Yes, I'm that old, though I was turned when I was 25 in human years. My oath was to preserve life, to ease suffering regardless of species. You came to our gates on the edge of death, cursed and injured. What kind of healer would I be if I turned you away simply because your heart beats and mine doesn't? 200 years old. The number should have been shocking, terrifying even, but somehow it just made me more curious. What was it like to live that long? To watch centuries pass while you remained unchanging?" I wanted to ask, but another memory suddenly surfaced, pulling my attention away. "The wraith," I said urgently, trying to sit up despite my body's protests. "It was chasing me because I found something. There was a tomb or a shrine, I can't quite remember. But there were artifacts, writings about the Old Covenant, the original treaty between—" The memory fragmented again, slipping through my mental grasp like smoke. Ilara's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something, concern? Recognition? Passing across her features. "The Old Covenant?" she repeated carefully. "Marcus, what exactly were you researching before you came to these mountains?" Before I could answer, before I could try to dig deeper into my fractured memories, the heavy wooden door to the infirmary swung open with a deep, resonant creak. Ilara's head snapped toward the entrance, her body tensing slightly, though she didn't release my hand. If anything, her grip tightened protectively. The figure that entered the room commanded attention in a way that was both immediate and undeniable. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with the kind of bearing that spoke of centuries of absolute authority. His hair was long and silver white, flowing past his shoulders in a straight cascade that caught the moonlight like liquid mercury. He wore formal attire that seemed to blend multiple historical periods. A high-collared coat of deep burgundy velvet over a black silk shirt, fitted trousers, and boots that were polished to a mirror shine. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as something other than human. They glowed with a deeper crimson than Ilara's, ancient and penetrating, as if they could see not just into you but through you, reading every secret your soul had ever held. "Lord Valerius," Ilara said, rising from her chair in a gesture of respect, though I noticed she still didn't let go of my hand. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow evening's rounds." So this was the Lord of Castle Nocturne himself. Despite my weakened state, I tried to sit up straighter, some instinct warning me that this was someone who demanded respect, whether you were his subject or not. Lord Valerius's gaze swept over me with the kind of assessment that felt clinical yet not unkind. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured, each word carefully articulated in an accent that sounded vaguely Eastern European but antiquated, as if he'd learned to speak in a time when languages were different. "So, our mysterious guest has finally awakened. Ilara has been quite adamant about your care, young man. I confess, I'm curious about what brings a human historian into my forests, pursued by a wraith no less." He moved further into the room with a fluid grace that was distinctly inhuman, yet there was nothing overtly threatening about his presence. He stopped at the foot of my bed, one hand resting on the ornate wooden post. "I am Valerius Nightborn, lord of this castle and protector of these mountains. You have been under my hospitality for 3 days, during which time my best healer has barely left your side." He glanced at Ilara with what might have been amusement. "She even postponed her scheduled rest period, insisting that your condition was too delicate to be left to the junior staff." Ilara's cheeks flushed again, visible even in her pale complexion. "His condition was delicate, my lord. The wraith curse was spreading faster than any case I'd seen before. It required constant monitoring and treatment." "I'm not criticizing, merely observing," Valerius replied, though there was definitely amusement in his ancient eyes now. "In fact, your dedication is commendable. But now that our guest is conscious, perhaps he can explain what he was doing in the Shadowmere forest. That particular stretch of woodland has been forbidden to outsiders for good reason, Marcus Thorne." The wraiths nest there, and they do not take kindly to trespassers. The way he said my name told me he'd already investigated who I was. Of course he had. You didn't survive as a vampire lord for what must be centuries by being careless about strangers appearing at your gates. I was researching, I said, my voice growing stronger now though still rough. The Old Covenant. I'm a historian specializing in supernatural treaties and accords. There were references in some obscure texts I found in Prague. Documents from the 1700s that mentioned a treaty signed here, in these very mountains between the vampire clans and the human kingdoms of the region. But the details were vague, deliberately obscured. I wanted to find the truth. Valerius's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. He exchanged a quick glance with Alara that I couldn't quite interpret. The Old Covenant, he said slowly. That is a name I have not heard spoken aloud in a very long time. Tell me, Marcus Thorne, what made you think it wise to go searching for evidence of something that most of the world has forgotten, or believes to be mere legend? I struggled to organize my thoughts, frustrated by the gaps in my memory. Because it wasn't just a treaty, was it? The documents suggested it was something more, something that fundamentally changed the relationship between humans and vampires in this region. There were references to a binding, to sacrifices made on both sides, I paused, forcing myself to remember. To a sacred trust that could never be broken without dire consequences. I found what I thought was a map, hidden in the margin illustrations of an illuminated manuscript. It led me to a tomb in the forest, a structure that predated even the oldest human settlements in these mountains. And what did you find in this tomb? Valerius asked, his voice carefully neutral, but I could see the intensity in his gaze. I'm not entirely sure, I admitted. I remember entering, finding a chamber carved from black stone. There were inscriptions on the walls in a language I didn't recognize. Not Latin, not any of the old Slavic tongues, something older. And there was a chest, iron-bound and locked with what looked like silver chains. I couldn't open it, but I was documenting the inscriptions when the memory hit me like a physical blow. When the wraith appeared. It rose from the shadows as if it had been waiting, guarding the place. It said something to me before it attacked. It said, the pact breaker comes seeking secrets. The debt must be paid in blood and memory. The silence that followed my words was heavy, oppressive. Ilara's hand trembled slightly in mine, and Lord Valerius's expression had turned grave, almost troubled. For a being who had likely witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, who had lived through centuries of history, to look troubled was deeply unsettling. This is more serious than I anticipated, Valerius said finally. He moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape beyond the castle walls. The wraith called you a pact breaker. That is a title, not an accusation. It means the tomb you found wasn't simply a historical curiosity, Marcus. It was a sacred site, one of the anchoring points of the Old Covenant itself. By entering it, by attempting to access its secrets, you inadvertently triggered ancient protective wards. He turned back to face me, and for the first time, I saw something like concern in his ancient features. The Old Covenant was not merely a treaty. It was a magical binding, a pact sealed with the blood of 12 vampire lords and 12 human nobles. It created a mystical barrier around these mountains, protecting both vampire and human settlements from the truly dark things that lurk in the deepest places of the world. The wraiths, yes, but also worse things, entities that predate human civilization. The Covenant has kept those horrors contained in the deep forests for 300 years. But if the tomb was sealed and protected, Ilara interjected, her voice tight with worry, and if the wraith accused him of being a pact breaker, does that mean? It means, Valerius interrupted, his voice grim, that the Covenant may have interpreted Marcus's intrusion as an attempt to break the binding, which would explain why the wraith curse was spreading so rapidly through him. He wasn't simply attacked, he was being marked as a violator of sacred law. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. But I didn't know, I protested. I was just researching history. I had no intention of breaking any pact or violating any sacred site. I didn't even know the Covenant was real. I thought it was just legend. Intention matters little to ancient magic, Valerius replied, though his tone was not unkind. But this does present us with a significant problem. If the Covenant has marked you as a pact breaker, then the curse will return, even after Ilara's excellent treatment. It will hunt you slowly but inevitably unless He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. Unless what? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Unless the marking is removed by one of the original signatories of the covenant, or their direct bloodline descendants, Valerius said. Fortunately, I am one such descendant. My great-grandfather was among the 12 vampire lords who created the binding. I carry his blood, and thus his authority over the covenant's magic. Relief flooded through me so intense it was almost dizzying. So you can remove the curse? Completely? I can, Valerius confirmed. But it will require a ritual, one that is not without its own complications. The covenant's magic requires balance, you see. If I am to unmake what the Wraith has marked, there must be a substitution, an alternative bond to take the curse's place. He looked pointedly at where my hand was still joined with Alara's. Tell me, Marcus, how did you come to be holding my head healer's hand so intimately? Ilara's blush deepened to the point where even in the moonlit dimness, it was unmistakably visible, a soft rose color suffusing her pale cheeks. She looked down at our joined hands as if seeing them for the first time, though she made no move to pull away. It wasn't intentional, my lord, she said quietly. When I was treating the curse, extracting the dark magic, the patient was in tremendous pain. He was unconscious, but his body was thrashing, fighting against the treatment. I took his hand to steady him and, she paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. And his suffering lessened. The curse's grip weakened when we were in physical contact. I thought perhaps it was a fluke, so I released him, but immediately the curse surged back stronger. So I held on and kept holding on for 3 days. She finally looked up at Lord Valerius, and there was a defiant edge to her voice now, protective and unwavering. I would do it again without hesitation. His life was more important than propriety. Something flickered in Valerius's expression, approval, perhaps, or recognition. I'm not chastising you, Alara. In fact, you may have inadvertently provided us with a solution to our current predicament. The curse weakened because of a resonance, a compatibility between your essence and his. Such things are rare but not unheard of. It suggests that a bond between the two of you would be acceptable to the Covenant's magic as a substitute for the curse mark. A bond? I asked, looking between them. What kind of bond? Valerius moved away from the window, pacing slowly as he explained. His movements were measured, elegant, like a professor delivering a lecture on complex material. The Old Covenant was predicated on the idea of unity between species, of chosen connections that would reinforce the magical barrier. The original signatories each formed what we called a blood bond, not the predatory master-servant relationship of vampiric thralls you might read about in your history books, but something more balanced. A conscious, willing connection between a vampire and a human, where life force could be shared without harm to either party. He stopped, fixing me with that penetrating crimson gaze. If you were to form such a bond with Alara, it would accomplish 2 things. First, it would satisfy the Covenant's magic, replacing the curse mark with a legitimate connection. Second, it would grant you the protection of the Nightborn Court. The Wraiths would recognize you as under our aegis and would no longer hunt you. I processed this information slowly, my historian's mind trying to separate the practical from the legendary. This blood bond, I said carefully, what exactly would it entail? Would I become, like you, a vampire? No, Ilara answered before Valerius could, her voice soft but certain. A blood bond doesn't turn humans into vampires. That's a separate process entirely, and one that requires explicit consent and a completely different ritual. A blood bond is more like a tether. I would share a small portion of my immortal essence with you, enough to mark you as mine, as protected by me, she corrected quickly. And in return you would offer voluntary blood donations, not draining or harmful amounts, just enough to maintain the connection. It would also create an empathic link between us. I would be able to sense your emotional state, your general location, whether you were in danger. It's an intimate connection, Valerius added bluntly. Make no mistake about that. It's not marriage, not servitude, but it is profound. You would be bound to Alara, and she to you for as long as both of you lived, which, given the sharing of vampiric essence, would likely mean you'd age much more slowly than a normal human. You might live for centuries, though not immortally as she does. Centuries. The word hung in the air between us. A week ago, I'd been a relatively ordinary historian, albeit one with a fascination for the supernatural. Now I was being offered a chance to live for centuries, to be bound to a vampire, to become part of a world I'd only studied from the outside. It should have been terrifying. It should have sent me scrambling to refuse to find another way. But I looked at Alara, at her gentle crimson eyes that watched me with a mixture of hope and fear, at the hand still clasped in mine, the hand that had held on to me for 3 days straight to keep me alive. I thought about her dedication, her oath as a healer, the way she'd spoken about preserving life regardless of species. I thought about that soft giggle, about the blush on her pale cheeks, about the inherent contradiction of a vampire who spent her immortality caring for others rather than preying on them. If I refuse, I asked quietly, what happens? I will still perform the ritual to temporarily suppress the curse, Valerius said. You would be free to leave the castle to return to your life. But the curse would remain dormant, not cured, and it would eventually resurface. Months from now, perhaps a year, but it would return. And when it did, you would need to come back here for another suppression, again and again for the rest of your life. Or, Alara said softly, you accept the bond and you're free. Truly free, but, she hesitated, vulnerability clear in her expression. But bound to me. I would understand if that wasn't something you wanted. We've only just met after all. You don't know me, don't know if you could trust me with such a connection. She was giving me an out, I realized. Despite whatever she might feel, despite the fact that she'd clearly gone above and beyond in caring for me, she was offering me the choice without pressure. There was something deeply honorable in that, something that spoke to the core of who she was. Can I ask you something? I said to her. Anything, she replied. Why did you blush? Earlier, when you told me I'd held your hand all night. If it was just medical treatment, why did it embarrass you? For a moment I thought she might not answer. Valerius made a discreet sound that might have been a cough and moved toward the door. I believe I'll give you two some privacy to discuss this. Marcus, you don't need to decide immediately, but I will need an answer by tomorrow evening. That's when the temporary suppression ritual must be performed, and if you choose the bond, it's best done at the same time. He paused at the door, looking back at us with an expression that was surprisingly gentle for such an ancient, powerful being. For what it's worth, Alara is one of the finest individuals I've known in my 500 years of existence, human or vampire. Whatever you decide, you should know that. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Alone again with Alara, the room felt simultaneously larger and more intimate. The moonlight had shifted slightly, painting new patterns across the stone floor. She still hadn't answered my question, and I waited patiently, sensing that this was important. I blushed, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, because it wasn't just medical treatment. Not entirely. You were holding my hand for comfort, yes, but I was holding yours for the same reason. Somewhere during that first night, watching over you, listening to your heartbeat steady and your breathing even out, I found myself hoping you would wake up. Not just as a healer hoping her patient would recover, but as, she struggled with the words, as someone who wanted to know you. You talked in your sleep sometimes, fragments of thoughts. You spoke about wanting to understand the world, about believing that humans and supernatural beings didn't have to be enemies. You apologized for intruding in the tomb, said you meant no disrespect to the old ones. Even unconscious, even cursed, you were kind. She looked up at me, and there were unshed tears glistening in her crimson eyes, catching the moonlight like liquid rubies. I'm 200 years old, Marcus. I've treated thousands of patients in that time. And I've never, not once, felt what I felt sitting beside your bed for 3 days. I've never hoped so desperately that someone would wake up just so I could hear their voice, learn their story. So yes, I blushed because I was embarrassed that you'd discover I wasn't being entirely professional. That maybe, possibly, I'd been holding your hand as much for myself as for you. The confession hung between us like something tangible, like you could reach out and touch the vulnerability she just exposed. In my life, my normal human life that now felt impossibly distant, I'd had relationships, connections, moments of affection and attraction. But those had all developed gradually, through weeks or months of getting to know someone, through casual meetings and deliberate dates, through the slow building of trust and understanding. This was different. This was accelerated by circumstances, intensified by the supernatural nature of everything around us, and yet, and yet it felt more genuine than anything I'd experienced before. Maybe it was because when you're lying unconscious and cursed, being kept alive only by someone's unwavering dedication, the superficial layers get stripped away. Ilara hadn't known me as Marcus Thorne the historian, the academic with publications and professional credentials. She'd known me as a dying man who needed help, and she'd given it without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. And in doing so, she'd revealed exactly who she was. Selfless, dedicated, kind in a way that transcended species or circumstance. I should be more frightened than I am, I said softly. Everything I was taught, everything I read in preparing for my research, warned about vampires. About how they're dangerous, manipulative, how they see humans as lesser beings. I should be terrified of the idea of being bound to one for centuries. But you're not. Ilara asked, a fragile hope coloring her voice. I shook my head slowly. I'm not. And I think it's because I paused, trying to articulate something I barely understood myself. Because you've already shown me who you are. You spent 3 days holding my hand, Ilara. You skipped your own rest periods. You poured your skill and energy into saving someone you'd never met. And when you tell me about this bond, you're giving me every reason to refuse, every out you can think of, because my choice matters more to you than what you want. I shifted in the bed, ignoring the protest from my still healing body, turning to face her more directly. Can I tell you what I remember about my time in the darkness? I was aware sometimes. Not conscious, but present. And I remember your voice. You talked to me while you worked. You told me about the castle, about the patients you treated over the years, about a garden on the western terrace where moonflowers bloom all year round. You told me about learning medicine from a human doctor in Vienna in 1823, about how he taught you that healing was about seeing the person, not just the illness. You told me, my voice caught slightly. You told me that I was going to be fine, that you wouldn't let the darkness take me, that I had too much left to discover in the world. A single tear escaped down Ilara's cheek, a crystalline trail that caught the moonlight. You remember that? I remember your voice being the only thing that kept me tethered, I said. When the curse tried to pull me down into oblivion, when it felt like it would be easier to just let go, your voice was there, promising that someone was fighting for me. So no, I'm not frightened of being bound to you. If anything, I searched for the right word and found it. Honored. That you would want that connection with me. Marcus, she breathed, and hearing her say my name like that, with such tenderness and wonder, made something in my chest tighten pleasantly. I have questions, I added, because my historian's mind couldn't help itself. Practical ones about what this bond would mean day to day. But the fundamental decision, the core of it, yes, I accept. I want to form the blood bond with you. The smile that broke across Ilara's face was radiant, transforming her from beautiful to absolutely luminous. For a being that subsisted on blood and lived in eternal night, she suddenly looked like dawn itself. She let out a laugh that was part relief, part joy, pure and uninhibited. Truly? You're certain? I'm certain, I confirmed, and found that I was smiling too, broadly and genuinely. Although I should probably warn you, I'm a terrible patient. I don't follow instructions well, I get restless when confined to bed, and I have an unfortunate tendency to find trouble even when I'm not looking for it. Oh, I think I gathered that, Ilara replied with mock severity, though her eyes danced with amusement. You did, after all, manage to break into a sacred tomb and get cursed by a wraith while supposedly conducting peaceful research. Yes, I suspect you're going to keep my healing skills quite well practiced. We both laughed, and the sound filled the Gothic chamber with something it probably hadn't heard in ages. Uncomplicated happiness. It was absurd, really, laughing in a vampire's castle while discussing a mystical blood bond that would tie me to an immortal healer for potentially centuries. And yet it felt right, felt like the first truly right thing that had happened since I'd entered those cursed forests. Tell me about the practical aspects, I said once our laughter had settled into comfortable smiles. You mentioned voluntary blood donations. How often are we talking about? Ilara shifted her chair closer, becoming more businesslike though her hand remained warmly clasped around mine. For a bond to remain stable, I would need to take blood approximately once per month. It's not a large amount, comparable to what you might donate at a blood drive, perhaps a pint at most. The process isn't painful. In fact, most humans find it rather pleasant once the initial nervousness passes. Our saliva contains natural compounds that act as a mild euphoric and pain suppressant. It's an evolutionary adaptation to make feeding less traumatic for historical prey, but in a consensual bond context, it simply makes the experience comfortable. She continued, warming to the subject in a way that revealed her medical expertise. The vampiric essence I'll share with you will have several effects. Your healing will become enhanced. Injuries that might take weeks to recover from will heal in days. Your resistance to disease will increase dramatically. You'll essentially become immune to most human illnesses. Your aging will slow significantly, probably to about 1 year of aging for every 10 years that pass. And you'll gain a mild sensitivity to sunlight, not a burning vulnerability like true vampires have, but you'll likely find bright daylight uncomfortable and will prefer dawn, dusk, and cloudy days. I already prefer dawn and dusk, I admitted. I've always been a bit of a night owl. Used to drive my colleagues crazy when I'd send emails at 3 in the morning. Then you'll fit right in here, Ilara said with a grin. Most of the castle is awake during night hours, though we do have some daytime staff for managing affairs in the nearby towns. Which brings me to another practical matter. Where would you live? You'd be welcome to stay here in the castle permanently if you wished. We have extensive libraries that would likely fascinate you as a historian, and many of our older residents have first-hand memories of events you've only read about. But you'd also be free to maintain your own residence to continue your work. The bond doesn't require constant physical proximity. But you'd always know where I was? What I was feeling. I asked, trying to understand the empathic link she'd mentioned. To a degree, she confirmed. I'd sense your general direction and distance from me, and I'd be aware of strong emotions. Fear, pain, joy, anger. But it's not mind reading. Your thoughts would remain your own as would mine. Think of it as being able to hear the music of someone's emotions without understanding the specific words of their songs. I considered this. As someone who valued privacy, the idea of an empathic link should have been unsettling. But there was something reassuring about it too, the knowledge that someone would know if I was in danger, that I wouldn't face the darkness alone. And if someday one of us wanted to break the bond? Is that possible? Ilara's expression grew somber. It's possible, but it's not simple. Breaking a blood bond requires another ritual, one that's taxing on both parties. And it would sever not just the magical connection but also much of the emotional one. Bonded pairs who separate often report feeling incomplete afterward for years or even decades. It's not something to be done lightly. The bond is meant to be permanent, or at least very long-term. So I need to be sure, I said quietly. We both do. This isn't a decision to make based on gratitude or crisis or even just attraction. This is choosing to tie our lives together for potentially centuries. Yes, Ilara agreed, her crimson eyes searching mine. Which is why, despite everything I've said, despite what I feel, I'll ask you one final time. Marcus Thorne, are you absolutely certain this is what you want? I thought about my life before. The lonely academic apartments, the endless research that never seemed to connect me to anything real, the sense that I was always observing life through the lens of history rather than living it myself. I thought about waking up here in this Gothic castle, to find someone holding my hand. Someone who had chosen to hold on even when it cost her personally, even when it would have been easier to let go. I thought about the possibility of centuries ahead, of having time to truly understand the world I'd only glimpsed through research. Of moonflower gardens and ancient libraries and a companion who understood both the weight of years and the value of each individual moment. Of those gentle giggles and fierce dedication and the way she'd cried when I'd said I remembered her voice in the darkness. I've never been more certain of anything, I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. Lord Valerius returned the following evening, accompanied by 2 other vampires I hadn't met before. One was a woman who appeared to be in her 40s with silver streaks in her dark hair and eyes that glowed a softer amber rather than crimson. She introduced herself as Magistra Serafina, the castle's ritual specialist. The other was a younger-looking male vampire with sharp features and an elaborate coat embroidered with mystical symbols. He was introduced as Keeper Dorian, the guardian of the Covenant's sacred artifacts. I confess I'm pleased by your decision, Valerius said as the group assembled in the infirmary. Ilara deserves happiness, and you, Marcus, strike me as someone who will appreciate what you've been offered rather than taking it for granted. Now, the ritual we're about to perform is ancient, but not dangerous. provided everyone involved is willing. Are you both prepared? Elara and I nodded in unison. We'd spent much of the day talking, asking and answering questions, learning about each other in the compressed timeline that our circumstances demanded. I'd learned that her favorite color was deep purple, that she'd been a farmer's daughter before being turned, that she still missed the taste of fresh bread even after 2 centuries. She'd learned about my childhood fascination with legends, my complete inability to carry a tune, my dream of someday writing a comprehensive history of supernatural human relations. With each revelation, the decision had felt increasingly right. Magistress Serafina began arranging items on a small table that had been brought into the room. Candles of various colors, a silver chalice etched with symbols I recognized as Old Latin mixed with older runic alphabets, a ceremonial dagger with a handle carved from white wood, and several crystals that pulsed with faint inner light. The blood bond ritual, she explained as she worked, is in 3 parts. First, the acknowledgement, where both parties state their intentions before witnesses. Second, the exchange, where blood and essence are shared. Third, the sealing, where the bond is anchored to the covenant's magic so that it's recognized and protected. Will it hurt? I asked, eyeing the ceremonial dagger. No more than a small cut, Serafina assured me. The dagger is ensorcelled to make the cleanest possible incision. And Elara's bite, as she mentioned, will be quite comfortable. The magic itself might feel strange. Many describe it as a warmth spreading through the chest, but it shouldn't be painful. Keeper Dorian stepped forward holding an ornate wooden box. When he opened it, I saw a silver medallion resting on red velvet, its surface inscribed with the same crescent moon and blood drop symbol that adorned Elara's uniform. This is a covenant mark, he explained. Once the bond is sealed, you'll wear this, Marcus. It will identify you to any supernatural being as being under the Nightborn Court's protection. More importantly, it will serve as the anchor point for the bond's magic. He lifted the medallion, and I saw that it hung from a delicate silver chain. May I? He asked, gesturing toward me. At my nod, he fastened it around my neck. The metal was cool against my skin but warmed quickly, and I felt a faint tingle as it settled into place. Excellent, Valerius said. Now if everyone is ready, let us begin. Marcus, Elara, please stand together here. He indicated a space in the center of the room where Serafina had drawn a circle on the floor using what looked like salt mixed with powdered silver. Elara helped me out of bed, steadying me when my legs proved weaker than I'd expected after 3 days of confinement. We stepped into the circle together, facing each other, and suddenly the weight of what we were about to do hit me fully. This was real. In moments I would be bound to this woman, this vampire, for potentially centuries. My life would never be the same. Elara must have sensed my momentary panic because she squeezed my hand and whispered, "It's all right to be nervous. I'm nervous too. But we're choosing this together, remember?" I nodded, steadying myself and squeezed back. Magistress Serafina began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, her voice taking on a resonant quality that seemed to fill the room. The candles around us flared brighter, their flames stretching upward impossibly high without flickering. The crystals on the table pulsed in rhythm with her words, and I felt the air grow heavy with power, as if reality itself was paying attention. When she finished the chant, Valerius stepped forward. "We come to witness and bless the formation of a blood bond," he intoned formally. "As lord of this territory and descendant of the Covenant's original architects, I ask, Elara Moon Whisper of the Nightborn Court, do you willingly offer your essence to this human, knowing that you will be bound to his fate, responsible for his protection, connected to his mortal life?" "I do so willingly," Elara replied, her voice steady and clear despite the tremor I could feel in her hand. "Marcus Thorne, human historian, do you willingly accept Elara's essence, knowing that you will be bound to her fate, marked as hers in the eyes of the supernatural world, forever changed from what you were?" "I do so willingly," I said, surprised by how firm my own voice sounded. "Then let the exchange begin," Valerius declared, stepping back. Serafina lifted the ceremonial dagger, and Elara extended her left hand palm up. The blade flashed once in the candlelight, making a precise cut across her palm. Blood welled up, but it wasn't the bright red of human blood. It was darker, with an almost iridescent quality, like garnets mixed with shadow. Serafina held the silver chalice under Elara's hand, catching several drops before pressing a white cloth to the wound. Then it was my turn. The dagger touched my palm and there was a brief sting, then nothing. My blood, normal human red, dripped into the chalice mixing with Alara's. The combinations swirled together and for a moment I could have sworn the mixture glowed. Serafina added something from a small vial, spoke a few more words, then handed the chalice to Alara. "Drink first," she instructed. "Then offer it to him." Alara brought the chalice to her lips and drank, her eyes never leaving mine. When she lowered it and offered it to me, her expression was solemn, sacred. "My essence to yours," she said softly. "My strength to sustain you, my life to protect yours." I took the chalice, noticing that my hand was shaking slightly. The mixture inside looked like wine mixed with starlight. I raised it to my lips and drank, and it was like nothing I'd ever tasted. Sweet and metallic and ancient all at once, like drinking moonlight and memory. It was warm going down, spreading through my chest and radiating outward through my limbs. I felt my heartbeat synchronize with something else, a slower rhythm that I realized was Alara's pulse. The medallion around my neck flared with sudden heat, not burning but intense, and I gasped. "Now," Serafina said urgently, "the bite must complete the bond while the magic is active." Alara stepped closer, one hand coming up to cup my cheek gently. "It won't hurt," she promised. "Trust me." I tilted my head, exposing my neck, and felt her cool breath against my skin for a moment before her lips touched the pulse point. There was a brief pressure and then, she'd been right. It didn't hurt at all. Instead, there was a sensation of warm honey spreading through my veins, a pleasant languor that made every nerve ending sing. I felt her drawing blood, but rather than weakening me, it felt like she was drawing out tension, stress, pain, all the accumulated exhaustion of my ordeal. In return, something flowed back into me, cool and vital and impossibly old, something that tasted of moonlight and eternal night and the deep magic of the earth. The empathic link opened like a flower blooming in my mind. Suddenly I could feel Alara's emotions as clearly as my own. Her nervousness about the ritual, her fierce protectiveness of me, her joy at the bond forming, and underneath it all, a deep well of affection that took my breath away. And I knew through the link that she could feel my emotions too. My wonder, my certainty that I'd made the right choice, my growing attachment to her. When she pulled back, her eyes were glowing more brightly than I'd ever seen them, radiant crimson stars. There were tears on her cheeks again, but she was smiling. "I can feel you," she whispered in amazement. "You're there in my heart like you've always been there." "I feel you too," I managed to say, my voice rough with emotion. "It's incredible." The medallion pulsed one final time, and Magistra Serafina raised her hands. "By blood and will, by essence and intent, let this bond be sealed. Let it be recognized by the old covenant, protected by its power, anchored in its magic. So it is witnessed, so it is done." The candles flared so brightly I had to close my eyes, and for a moment, I felt a presence, something vast and ancient and watchful, as if the covenant itself was examining what we'd done. Then there was a sense of approval, of being acknowledged and accepted, and the presence faded. When I opened my eyes again, the candles had returned to normal flames, the crystals had gone dark, and the salt circle on the floor was gone as if it had never been there. But the warmth in my chest remained, and the link to Alara was still there, a constant gentle presence in the back of my mind. "It's done," Valerius said, and there was genuine warmth in his ancient voice. "The bond is formed and sealed. Marcus Thorn, you are now formally under the protection of House Nightborn, bound to our head healer. May your centuries together be filled with purpose and joy." He inclined his head respectfully to both of us. "Welcome to the family, Marcus." The days following the bonding ritual passed in a strange blend of recovery and discovery. My body healed with remarkable speed. By the third day after the ritual, I felt stronger than I had in years, as if I'd shed a decade of accumulated fatigue. The empathic link with Alara remained a constant presence, initially startling but quickly becoming as natural as breathing. I learned to distinguish between my emotions and hers, though there was considerable overlap, particularly in moments of shared experience. Alara showed me around Castle Nocturne, and it proved to be a revelation. The structure was far larger than I'd initially realized, sprawling across an entire mountainside with wings and towers built in different architectural styles spanning centuries. There was a library that made my historian's heart race. 3 floors of books, scrolls, and manuscripts, some dating back to before the printing press. "Help yourself to anything here," Ilara had said with an amused smile as I'd stood gaping at the collection. "Though I should warn you, once you start, you might lose track of several weeks. I've seen it happen to scholars before." I met more of the castle's inhabitants, and my preconceptions about vampires continued to crumble. There was Lady Miriam, an ancient vampire who spent her nights corresponding with botanists around the world about cultivating night-blooming plants. There was young Thomas, young by vampire standards only 80 years old, who was passionate about modern technology and had set up an entire computer lab in one of the castle's towers. There was Marcus, we shared a name which led to some amusing confusion, who was a musician that composed hauntingly beautiful pieces on a centuries-old organ in the castle's chapel. They were individuals, I realized, not the homogeneous monsters that folklore suggested. They had personalities, interests, conflicts, and friendships. They teased each other, debated philosophy over evening meals of donated blood served in elegant wine glasses, and showed genuine interest in my presence among them. "You're adjusting well," Ilara commented one evening as we walked through the moonflower garden she told me about during my unconsciousness. She'd been right. It was beautiful, filled with pale flowers that glowed softly in the darkness and released a subtle, sweet fragrance. Most newly bonded humans take weeks to feel comfortable in vampire spaces. You've taken to it like you were born for this life. "I think I was always more comfortable with the night than the day," I admitted, pausing to examine a particularly large moonflower bloom. "Even before the bond, I did my best work after sunset. My graduate advisor used to joke that I was a vampire in training." I laughed at the irony of that statement. Ilara smiled, but there was a hint of concern in her expression that I could feel echoing through our bond. "Marcus, can I ask you something? And I want you to be completely honest." "Of course," I said, turning to face her fully. "Do you have any regrets? About the bond, about staying here, about me?" The vulnerability in her voice was palpable, and through the link I felt her fear, not of me but of having somehow trapped me, of having taken advantage of my gratitude and my circumstances. I reached out and took both her hands in mine, looking directly into those luminous crimson eyes. "Ilara, I have exactly 0 regrets. If anything, I'm amazed that someone like you, someone who's lived for 2 centuries, who's seen and experienced so much, would want to be bound to someone like me. I'm just a historian who stumbled into something far bigger than himself and got lucky enough to be saved by the most remarkable person he's ever met." Her expression softened, relief and joy flooding through the bond. "You're not just anything, Marcus. You're curious and kind and brave enough to say yes to the unknown. Do you know how rare that is? Most humans would have fled the moment they were well enough to walk, bond or no bond. But you stayed. You're trying to understand us rather than fear us. You're exactly the kind of person the Old Covenant was meant to protect. Someone who can bridge worlds." "Speaking of the Covenant," I said, an idea forming. "I'd like to go back. To the tomb where all this started. With proper preparation this time and with you beside me. I want to understand what I found, what those inscriptions meant. Maybe," I paused, making sure this was my idea and not some compulsion. "Maybe I could help document it properly, create a real historical record of the Old Covenant. Not to expose it to the world, but to preserve the truth for those who are part of that world." Ilara's eyes widened. "That's actually a wonderful idea. Lord Valerius has been saying for years that we need proper documentation of our history, written by someone who understands both the scholarship and the supernatural reality. But Marcus, are you sure you want to return to the place where you were cursed? With you beside me?" I said. "I'm sure. Besides, I have protection now." I touched the medallion that I'd barely taken off since the ritual. "And more importantly, I have someone who'll hold my hand through whatever comes." She laughed at that, the sound as musical as always. "Oh, so you've developed a habit of hand-holding now, have you?" "I learned from the best," I teased back, and then more seriously, "Ilara, you held on when it would have been easier to let go. That meant everything to me. Still means everything. So yes, if I'm going to face potentially dangerous supernatural sights, I want you there. Not just because you're my bonded partner, but because I trust you completely." The emotion that flowed through the link was so intense and warm that for a moment I was overwhelmed. Ilara stepped closer, rising on her toes to press a gentle kiss to my cheek. Then we'll go together, she promised. I'll speak to Lord Valerius about organizing a proper expedition. We'll bring Keeper Dorian. He knows more about the Covenant's sacred sites than anyone. And Magistra Seraphina, in case there are any magical protections that need to be carefully dismantled. We'll do this right. Thank you, I said softly. Then, feeling bold, I added, you know, when you told me I held your hand all night, you said it was endearing. Can I tell you what I find endearing about you? She tilted her head curiously, a small smile playing at her lips. What's that? The way you giggle. So unexpected. Vampires aren't supposed to giggle. They're supposed to be all dark and brooding and mysterious. But you giggle and it's the most genuinely joyful sound I've ever heard. It makes me smile every time. She blushed. I was getting used to seeing that faint rose color in her pale cheeks. And yes, she giggled, proving my point perfectly. I can't help it, she admitted. I've always been this way even before I was turned. My mother used to say I'd laugh at a rainstorm. It used to embarrass me actually, especially around the more serious vampires. They'd look at me like I was peculiar. You are peculiar, I said, and when her expression faltered, I quickly added, peculiar in the best possible way. Peculiar like finding a flower growing in an unexpected place, or discovering a book you weren't looking for that turns out to be exactly what you needed. Peculiar like being a vampire who dedicated her immortality to healing instead of hunting. Don't ever think that's something to be embarrassed about, Ilara. It's what makes you extraordinary. A week later, our expedition was ready. Keeper Dorian had spent days preparing protective wards and researching the historical records of the tomb's location. Magistra Seraphina had assembled a collection of mystical tools for safely analyzing any magic we might encounter. Lord Valerius himself had decided to join us, citing both his authority as a Covenant descendant and his admitted curiosity about what had drawn a human historian so recklessly into forbidden territory. We set out at dusk, traveling in a manner I hadn't expected, not by carriage or even on foot, but through what Dorian called the shadow paths. It was a form of vampire magic that allowed for rapid travel through darkness itself, stepping into a shadow in the castle and emerging from another shadow miles away in the forest. The experience was disorienting, like being briefly compressed into something smaller than yourself, but not painful. When we materialized in the forest, I immediately recognized the area. The massive old-growth trees, the particular way the twilight filtered through the canopy, the sense of watching eyes that wasn't entirely paranoia. There, I said, pointing toward a rocky outcropping. The tomb entrance is behind those rocks, concealed by a fairly sophisticated illusion spell. I only found it because I was using a detection charm I'd purchased from a dealer in Vienna. An illusion spell that's lasted for 3 centuries, Valerius murmured appreciatively. The builders were thorough. Dorian, if you would. The keeper stepped forward, pulling out what looked like a compass made of silver and crystal. He moved it in a careful pattern, muttering under his breath, and suddenly the rocks shimmered and revealed a narrow opening in the stone, leading downward. The protection wards are still active, he announced. But they should recognize Lord Valerius's bloodline and Magistra Seraphina's ritual authority. Marcus, you're bonded to Ilara who serves the Nightborn court, so you should also be granted passage. Everyone stay close together just in case. We descended into the earth, Seraphina conjuring small orbs of light that floated around us, illuminating the carved stone passage. The walls were covered in the inscriptions I remembered, and now, with Ilara's hand in mine and the bond steadying my nerves, I could appreciate their artistry. They told a story I realized reading as we walked. A story of a time when the barrier between the mortal world and darker dimensions had worn thin, when creatures of nightmare had begun to slip through. In the year when 3 moons rose together, I translated aloud, running my free hand over the carvings, the darkness beneath the mountains stirred. From the deep places came the devourers, the wraiths, the things that should not be. They fed upon fear and flesh, and no mortal army could stand against them. The time of shadows, Valerius said grimly. I was young then, barely a century old, but I remember the stories my grandfather told. It was chaos, Marcus. Entire villages disappeared overnight. Even we vampires, with all our power, were hunted by things older and far more terrible. I continued reading as we descended deeper. Then came together the 12 lords of night and the 12 lords of day. In desperation and hope they forged the old covenant. Blood of the immortal, blood of the mortal, mixed and bound by sacred oath. A barrier was raised, anchored in 12 sacred sites, sealed with the lives of those who swore the first oath. Sealed with their lives? Elara asked quietly, gripping my hand tighter. The original signatories knew they might not survive the ritual, Serafina explained. Creating a magical barrier powerful enough to contain entities from other dimensions required enormous sacrifice. Some did die. Others were permanently changed. But they did it anyway because the alternative was the extinction of both our species. We reached the chamber I remembered and I stopped short. It looked different than it had in my panicked memories. The black stone walls seemed less ominous now, more solemn, like the walls of a memorial. The chest was still there in the center of the room, bound in silver chains, but surrounding it were statues, 24 of them, arranged in a circle, each one depicting a different figure. 12 wore crowns and armor in human style. 12 wore elegant robes and had the unmistakable elongated features of vampires. The original signatories, Valerius breathed, his eyes wide. I've heard descriptions but I never thought. Marcus, do you understand what you found? This isn't just a tomb. This is the first sanctum, the place where the old covenant was originally sworn. We thought it had been lost, deliberately hidden so thoroughly that even we descendants couldn't locate it. Keeper Dorian was already moving around the room, his hands trembling with excitement as he examined the statues and inscriptions. This is incredible. These are their actual likenesses. And look, he pointed to the chest. That's not just a storage container. That's the Covenant archive. All the original documents, the exact wording of every oath, possibly even samples of the blood that was used in the binding. Why hide it so thoroughly though? I asked. If this is so important, why make it nearly impossible to find? Because knowledge is power, Magistra Serafina said, running her fingers carefully over one of the statues. If someone, human or vampire, with ill intent learned the exact mechanics of how the covenant was constructed, they might find a way to unmake it. Or worse, to corrupt it, to bend its power to their own use. The signatories hid this place to protect not just the knowledge, but the world that knowledge protects. Then why did the Wraith attack me? I asked. I wasn't trying to unmake anything. I just wanted to understand. Valerius turned to me, his ancient eyes thoughtful. The protective wards here are old, Marcus, and very powerful, but they're not intelligent in the way a living guardian would be. They operate on simple rules. Those of the bloodlines may enter, those who serve the covenant may enter, all others are intruders. You were none of those things when you first came here. The wards summoned a wraith to drive you away, and when you persisted in trying to access the chamber, it escalated to a curse. The magic was doing its job, protecting this place from what it perceived as a threat. But I'm not a threat, I protested. No, Elara said gently, you're not. But the wards couldn't know that. They couldn't know that you were seeking knowledge out of respect and curiosity, not greed or malice. That's the tragedy of ancient protective magic. It can't see intent, only action. However, Dorian interjected, now that you're bonded to Elara, now that you bear the covenant mark, you're part of the system. The wards will recognize you as legitimate. Which means, he looked to Valerius for confirmation. The vampire lord nodded slowly. Which means, if Marcus is willing, he has the right to study this place to document it properly. The covenant has been operating for 3 centuries on tradition and fragments of memory passed down through generations. But the original texts are here, the complete knowledge. We could finally understand every aspect of the magic that protects us. We could strengthen it, adapt it to the modern world, ensure it endures for another 3 centuries and beyond. He turned to me fully. Marcus Thorne, I know this isn't what you expected when you came seeking knowledge. But I'm offering you a role if you'll accept it. Become the keeper of the old covenant's history. Study this place, translate these texts, preserve this knowledge. It would be a life's work, though with your extended lifespan you'll have the time to do it justice. What do you say? I looked around the chamber, at the statues of those who had sacrificed everything to protect the future, at the inscriptions that held secrets forgotten by the world above. I thought about my life before, teaching disinterested undergraduates, publishing papers that a handful of specialists might read, always feeling like I was on the outside of history looking in. And I felt Alara's presence through the bond, felt her confidence in me, her belief that I could handle this responsibility. I say yes, I replied firmly. I'll do it. I'll preserve this history, honor these sacrifices, and help ensure the covenant endures. Valerius smiled, showing his fangs, but it was a genuine expression of pleasure. Then welcome, Marcus Thorne, to your true calling. Months passed, then a year, then two. My work in the first sanctum became the center of my existence in the best possible way. Each descent into that sacred space revealed new insights, new connections I hadn't seen before. The original documents in the Covenant archive were written in 7 different languages, and I spent my days, or rather my nights, translating, cross-referencing, slowly building a comprehensive understanding of the magical and political framework that had shaped the relationship between humans and vampires in this region for 3 centuries. But the work, as fulfilling as it was, wasn't the only thing that defined my new life. There was Alara. Our bond deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. The empathic link that had initially been novel became as natural as breathing, a constant comfortable awareness of each other's presence. I learned to read the subtle shifts in her emotions, to know when she needed company and when she needed solitude. She learned the same about me, appearing in the library precisely when I'd been stuck on a translation for too long, coaxing me away for walks in the Moonflower Garden, or, on one memorable occasion, teaching me to dance in the castle's ballroom at 3 in the morning. The monthly blood donations became a ritual we both looked forward to, not for any sinister reason, but because it was our time, intimate and private. Alara always made sure I was comfortable, always asked permission even though the bond technically meant she didn't need to. Consent isn't a one-time thing, she told me. Just because you agreed once doesn't mean you agree forever. I'll ask every time, Marcus, because respecting your choice matters more than tradition. My body continued to change in subtle ways. My eyesight sharpened, becoming acute enough to read in candlelight that would have been impossibly dim before. My healing remained enhanced. A nasty cut I'd gotten from a rough stone edge in the sanctum healed completely within a day, leaving no scar. And the aging. Well, I couldn't see the difference myself, but Alara swore that I looked exactly the same as the day we'd bonded, while 2 years should have shown at least some small signs of aging. You're going to be stuck looking like you're in your late 20s for the next century at least, she teased. I hope you're okay with that. As long as I'm looking young while standing next to you, I think I can manage, I'd replied, making her giggle in that way that still made me smile every time. I maintained connections to the human world too. Lord Valerius had been true to his word about the bond not requiring isolation. I kept my academic credentials, published papers, carefully edited to remove any references to actual supernatural findings, and even taught occasional online seminars about medieval history. My colleagues assumed I'd taken a long-term research position at a private archive in Eastern Europe, which was technically true, just not in the way they imagined. I also spent time in the nearby human town of Ravenholm, which existed in a unique symbiotic relationship with Castle Nocturne. The townspeople knew exactly what their mountainside neighbors were, and not only accepted it but benefited from it. Vampire patrols kept the dangerous creatures of the deep forest away from the town. Vampire wealth funded infrastructure improvements. And the voluntary blood donation program, which I now participated in as a donor advocate, provided the castle's residents with sustenance while giving human participants generous compensation and excellent medical care. You've become a bridge, Alara told me one evening as we sat on one of the castle's high terraces watching the stars. Between our world and theirs. You help the humans understand that we're not monsters, and you help my kind remember what it's like to be human. It's exactly what the Covenant was meant to foster. I just talk to people, I said modestly. You do more than talk, she insisted. You listen. You try to understand both sides. That's rare, Marcus. Most beings, human or vampire, get locked into their own perspective. You keep an open mind and an open heart. She leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder, comfortable and warm despite her naturally cool temperature. I'm so glad you held my hand that night. I laughed. I was unconscious. I didn't exactly make a choice. Maybe your subconscious knew what it was doing, she suggested playfully. Maybe some part of you recognized that I was safe, that I was someone worth holding on to. Well, my subconscious has excellent judgment then, I said, wrapping an arm around her. Because you're definitely someone worth holding on to. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, and I found myself thinking about how much had changed. 2 years ago, I'd been alone, driven by academic curiosity, seeking the truth about legends and old stories. Now I was part of a legend myself, bound to an immortal healer, living in a vampire castle, entrusted with preserving the history of an ancient magical covenant. It should have felt surreal, overwhelming, impossible. Instead, it felt like coming home. Ilara, I said softly, do you remember when you asked if I had any regrets? I remember, she replied, a hint of concern entering her voice. I still don't have any, I assured her quickly. But I wanted to say something more. These past 2 years have been the happiest of my life. Not just because of the work, though I love that. Not just because I'm living in a castle and learning vampire magic, though that's fascinating. But because of you. Because I wake up every night. Yes, I've officially switched to a nocturnal schedule, and I know that I'll see you. That we'll talk, work together, laugh together. That I'm not alone anymore, and neither are you. I felt her emotions through the bond, a warm surge of affection and joy and something deeper, something I was pretty sure was love though neither of us had said the word yet. Marcus, she whispered. I'm not good at romantic speeches, I continued, feeling suddenly nervous. I'm a historian, I deal in facts and documents and translations. But here's a fact, you are the best thing that's ever happened to me. Here's a document, the bond that ties us together. And here's my translation of what I feel. I love you, Ilara. Completely, certainly, with everything I am. She lifted her head from my shoulder, and in the starlight, I could see tears glistening in her crimson eyes. You love me? She asked, her voice trembling. I love you, I confirmed. I probably have since that first morning when you told me I'd held your hand all night and you blushed about it. I just took a while to translate the feeling into words. She laughed through her tears and then she kissed me. Not the gentle cheek kiss she'd given me in the garden months ago, but a real kiss, deep and passionate and full of all the feelings we'd been carefully building over the past 2 years. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. Well, I was breathless. She didn't technically need to breathe, but she was doing it anyway out of habit and emotion. I love you too, she said, her voice full of wonder. I have for so long. I was afraid to say it, afraid it would be too much too fast, afraid you'd feel pressured by the bond. But Marcus, what I feel for you isn't because of the bond. The bond just lets me feel it more clearly, share it with you more completely. So we're in love, I said, still marveling at how natural it felt to say that. A human historian and a vampire healer. That's got to be a story for the ages. Our story, Ilara agreed, snuggling back against me. And we have centuries to write it. On the 2-year anniversary of our bonding, Ilara surprised me. I'd been working in the sanctum, carefully photographing a series of inscriptions that detailed the exact ritual components used in the original covenant ceremony, when I felt a surge of excitement through our link. Not distress or danger, but pure, bubbling anticipation. I packed up my equipment and made my way back to the castle, curious about what had her so energized. I found her in her quarters. She'd maintained her own room even though I'd been practically living in mine, both of us respecting the boundary of private space even as our lives intertwined more each day. Close your eyes, she said as soon as I entered, bouncing slightly on her toes in a display of excitement that was utterly endearing. What are you planning? I asked suspiciously, but I closed my eyes. I heard her moving around, the rustle of paper, the soft thud of something being set down. Then her cool hand took mine. Okay, you can look. I opened my eyes to find her sitting on the floor, the actual floor, which was very un-Ilara-like in its informality, surrounded by what looked like dozens of books, journals, and loose papers. What is all this? I asked, sitting down across from her. Your anniversary present, she said, practically glowing with pride. I've been working on it for months. You know how you've been translating the old covenant documents and building your archive of the supernatural history of this region? Yes. I said slowly, wondering where this was going. Well, I realize that your work is creating an incredible resource, but it's all focused on the past. The historical record stops 300 years ago with the signing of the covenant. So I thought, why not document the present? Create a living history to complement your ancient one? She gestured to the materials around her. These are interviews I've been conducting with vampires throughout the region, asking them about their lives, their experiences, how the covenant has affected them. And look, she handed me a particularly thick journal, and when I opened it, I recognized her elegant handwriting filling page after page. The first entry was titled, Interview with Lady Miriam Thornrose, age 487, botanist and third-generation covenant beneficiary. Elara, I breathed, carefully turning pages. This is incredible. These are primary sources, first-hand accounts from beings who've lived through centuries of history. Do you know how valuable this is? I hoped you'd think so, she said, relief evident in her voice. I know I'm not a historian like you, but I try to ask good questions to get them to talk about not just events but feelings, experiences, what it was like to live through different eras. I kept reading, completely absorbed. Lady Miriam's account included her memories of the Industrial Revolution, how the spread of railroads and factories had made it harder for vampires to maintain their hidden enclaves. There were entries from Thomas about the rise of the internet and how it had both complicated and facilitated supernatural secrecy. There was even an interview with Lord Valerius himself, discussing the burden of leadership across centuries, the difficulty of balancing tradition with necessary change. This isn't just valuable, I said, looking up at her with awe. This is groundbreaking. Elara, you've created an oral history project for immortal beings. As far as I know, nothing like this exists anywhere. Most supernatural creatures are so private, so secretive, they'd never agree to being interviewed like this. They did it for me, she said with a modest shrug. Because they know I'll treat their stories with respect, that I'm not trying to expose them or sensationalize anything. And because, she paused, a blush creeping into her cheeks. Because I told them it was for you. That I wanted to give you something that would help your work, that would show how much I believe in what you're doing. I set the journal down carefully and moved around the circle of books to sit beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me, I said into her hair. Thank you. Thank you so much. There's more, she said, pulling back slightly. From beneath a stack of papers, she produced a single sheet that looked older than the others, the paper yellowed with age. This one I did an interview for. I wrote it myself, about my own life. My human life before I was turned. I've never told anyone the full story before, not even Lord Valerius. But I want you to know. Every part of me, human and vampire, past and present. I took the paper with reverent care. Are you sure? If this is private? I'm sure, she interrupted softly. You told me you loved me. I want you to know everything about the person you love. So I read and learned about Elara's life as a farmer's daughter in a small village in the 1820s, her early fascination with healing after watching the village's herbalist work, her determination to learn medicine despite the limitations placed on women of that era. I read about how she'd been attacked by a rogue vampire while traveling to apprentice with a doctor in the city, about how Lord Valerius himself had found her dying and offered her a choice: death or transformation. She'd chosen transformation, but only after making Valerius promise that she could continue her pursuit of healing, that she wouldn't be forced to be a predator. He kept his promise, she'd written. He found me teachers, supported my training, helped me develop healing techniques that worked with vampiric abilities rather than against them. He gave me the chance to be who I wanted to be, not what circumstances forced me to become. In 200 years, I have never taken a life. I have only saved them. It's the thing I'm most proud of. By the time I finished reading, I had tears in my eyes. I understood her so much better now. Her fierce dedication to healing, her gentle nature that seems so at odds with vampire stereotypes, her absolute conviction that consent and choice mattered above all else. She'd been given a choice in her darkest moment, and it had shaped everything she'd become. Thank you for trusting me with this, I said hoarsely. For letting me know all of you. It feels right, she said simply. You're my bondmate, my partner, the person I love. You should know the whole story. Then, with a mischievous glint in her eye, she added, besides, now you can interview me properly for your historical project. Elara Moon Whisper, age 221, healer and bonded partner to the Covenant historian who can't follow instructions not to investigate cursed tombs. I laughed, the emotional moment breaking into something lighter and more playful. Hey, that worked out pretty well for both of us. It did, she agreed, leaning against me. Though I still reserve the right to say, I told you so, about being reckless. Fair enough, I conceded. Then, struck by inspiration, I added, you gave me an incredible gift documenting other stories. Can I give you something in return? You don't have to, she protested. I didn't do this expecting reciprocation. I know. But I want to. I pulled out the silver medallion from under my shirt, the covenant mark that I wore every day. This marks me as protected, as belonging to the Nightborn court. But it's impersonal, generic. So I was thinking, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small box I'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I had this made in Ravenholm by a jeweler who works with the supernatural community. I opened the box to reveal a silver ring, delicate and elegant, with a small moonstone set in it. But the special part was the inner band, where I'd had the jeweler inscribe a phrase in the ancient language from the sanctum. It says, through darkness and light, forever bound, I explained. It's from one of the covenant inscriptions, part of the vows the original signatories made to each other. Ilara stared at the ring, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she looked up at me and there were tears streaming down her face. Marcus, is this, are you? It's a promise, I said, taking the ring from the box. We're already bonded magically, already committed to each other for as long as we both exist. But I wanted to give you something that says I choose you, not because of a curse or a ritual, but because I love you. Because I want to spend my centuries with you, learning and growing and holding your hand through whatever comes. Ilara Moon whisper, will you accept this ring and the promise it represents? Yes, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes, absolutely yes. I slid the ring onto her finger and she held it up to the candlelight, watching the moonstone catch and reflect the flames. Then she threw her arms around me and we held each other, two beings from different worlds who'd found something precious in each other. I love you, she whispered against my shoulder. My reckless historian who investigates cursed tombs and somehow makes it work out perfectly. I love you, I whispered back. My vampire healer who giggles and held my hand when I needed it most. 5 years after I'd woken beside a vampire nurse who'd held my hand through the darkest night, I stood once again in the first sanctum. But this time I wasn't alone, confused, or cursed. This time I was giving a presentation. The chamber had been transformed into a makeshift conference space, with chairs arranged in a semicircle around a projection screen I'd had installed. A jarring mix of ancient mysticism and modern technology that somehow worked. Seated before me was a delegation of vampire lords and human representatives from throughout the region, gathered for what we were calling the First Covenant Symposium. As you can see from the translated texts, I said, advancing to the next slide showing a photograph of one of the sanctum inscriptions, the original signatories intended for the covenant to be a living document, one that would adapt to changing times. They built in provisions for amendments, for bringing in new signatory lines, for expanding the protected territory. We've been operating for 3 centuries on a partial understanding of their vision. Now, with the full archive translated and documented, we can begin to fulfill their true intent. Lord Valerius, sitting in the front row, nodded approvingly. Beside him was Mayor Stephania of Ravenholm, representing the human settlements. In the rows behind were vampires from other territories, some who'd heard about the discovery of the sanctum and requested permission to see it for themselves, others who were descendants of the original signatories like Valerius. Dr. Thorne, one of the visiting vampire lords, Lady Anastasia from the Eastern Mountains, raised her hand. You're proposing significant changes to how the covenant operates. How can we be sure these changes honor the original intent rather than corrupting it? Excellent question, I replied. I'd been expecting it and had my answer prepared. Which is why I'm not proposing we implement anything immediately. Instead, I suggest we form a covenant council, made up of both vampire and human representatives, which would study the full documentation, debate the implications and make careful, considered decisions. Any changes would require unanimous agreement and would be implemented gradually, with careful monitoring of effects on the barrier magic. I clicked to the next slide, showing an organizational chart. Ilara and I have prepared a proposed structure for such a council, based on historical models we found in the archive. The original signatories actually maintained a similar body for the first 50 years after the Covenant's creation, before it fell into disuse as the crisis that prompted the Covenant faded from living memory. And who would lead this council? Asked Mayor Stephania. That's for you all to decide, I said. I'm a historian and translator, not a politician. My role is to provide the knowledge to ensure the historical record is accurate and accessible. How you use that knowledge to govern yourselves, that's your decision collectively. The discussion that followed was intense but productive. By the end of the 3-hour session, there was tentative agreement to form a provisional council, with representatives to be selected over the coming months. It wasn't a revolutionary change, but it was progress, a step toward realizing the full potential of what those first brave souls had created 3 centuries ago. As the delegation filed out, many stopping to examine the statues and inscriptions more closely, Hilara appeared at my side. She'd been sitting in the back, observing, her presence through the bond a constant source of support during my presentation. You did wonderfully, she said, slipping her hand into mine. The gesture had become so natural over the years that neither of us thought about it anymore. I think you convinced even the skeptics. We did wonderfully, I corrected. Your oral history project was cited at least a dozen times in the supporting documents. Your work showing how current vampire communities have adapted to modern life made a strong case for why updating the covenant makes sense. She smiled, that radiant expression that still made my heart skip. 5 years together, and she still affected me the same way she had that first morning. Speaking of which, she said, I have news. Lady Anastasia asked if I'd be willing to train some of her court members in the medical techniques I've developed. She wants to establish a proper healing facility in the Eastern Mountains, similar to what we have here. That's wonderful, I said, genuinely excited. Your work spreading beyond Castle Nocturne, you must be thrilled. I am, she confirmed. Though it would mean traveling to the east for a few months, spending time training them. I'd understand if you didn't want to leave your work here. We travel together, I interrupted firmly. Wherever you go, I go. That's the whole point of being bonded, isn't it? Through the link, I felt her relief and joy. Even after 5 years, she still sometimes worried that I'd choose my work over her, that the bond was more important to her than to me. I made a mental note to reassure her more often. Besides, I added, the Eastern Mountains have their own Covenant-era sites. I've been wanting to survey them for the archive. So this actually works out perfectly. You train healers, I document history, we explore a new region together. Sounds like an adventure. You and your adventures, she teased. Let's try not to get cursed this time, shall we? I make no promises, I replied with mock seriousness. But I do promise to hold your hand through whatever happens. She laughed, that beautiful giggle that still surprised visiting vampires who expected all of her kind to be somber and intimidating. You're never going to let me forget saying that, are you? Never, I confirmed. It's the moment that changed my life. Why would I ever forget it? We stood there in the sanctum, surrounded by the statues of the original signatories, the weight of history and the promise of the future balanced around us. I thought about that terrified historian who'd stumbled into this chamber 5 years ago, cursed and dying, and about the dedicated healer who'd refused to let him go. I thought about how fear and desperation had transformed into trust and love, how a crisis had become the foundation for something beautiful and enduring. Do you ever wonder what they'd think? I asked, gesturing to the statues. The original signatories. If they could see us now, see what their covenant has become, see a human and vampire not just working together but bonded, in love, building a life together. Do you think they'd be proud? Hilara was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she said, I think they'd be hopeful. They created the covenant in a time of darkness, fighting against forces that wanted to tear both our species apart. They proved that working together we could survive what neither could survive alone. We're living proof that their sacrifice wasn't in vain, that the world they fought for is possible. She turned to face me fully, taking both my hands in hers. And I think they'd tell us to keep going, to keep building on what they started. Not to be satisfied with just maintaining their legacy but to expand it, improve it, make it ours. Then that's what we'll do, I said. Together. Together, she agreed and kissed me there in the sanctum, surrounded by stone witnesses who'd seen the very first promises that had made our love possible. When we finally emerged from the tomb into the moonlit forest, a group was waiting for us. Lord Valerius, Mayor Stephania, Keeper Dorian, and several of the visiting delegates who'd stayed to explore the area. They'd set up a small celebration with tables laden with food for the humans and crystalware filled with donated blood for the vampires. A toast, Valerius announced, raising his glass. To Marcus and Alara, whose partnership embodies everything the Old Covenant was meant to achieve. To the bridges they're building between our worlds. And to the future they're helping us create. One where the barriers between human and vampire continue to fall, replaced by understanding, respect, and cooperation. To Marcus and Alara, the group chorused, raising their glasses. I looked at Alara, found her looking back at me with those luminous crimson eyes full of love and happiness. Through the bond, I felt her emotions mirroring mine. Gratitude for where we were, excitement for where we were going, and deep contentment with who we were becoming together. You know, I said softly just for her, when I woke up that morning 5 years ago and found you holding my hand, I was terrified. Everything I thought I knew about the world had just been shattered. I didn't know who you were, didn't know what was happening to me, didn't know if I'd survive another day. And now, she asked, that playful smile tugging at her lips. Now I know exactly who you are. You're my partner, my love, my home. I know what happened to me. I found the place I was always meant to be. And I know I'll survive not just another day but centuries of days, all of them better because you'll be there, holding my hand through whatever comes. She giggled, that wonderful sound that had first told me she was unlike any vampire from legend, and pulled me close. My reckless historian, she murmured affectionately, always turning things into speeches. It's what I do, I replied, unrepentant. I'm a keeper of history. And this, I gestured to the celebration around us, to the sanctum behind us, to the bond between us. This is history being made. Our history. And it's the greatest story I've ever had the privilege to document. Around us, the celebration continued, vampires and humans mingling freely, sharing stories and laughter under the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a wraith howled, but its cry was lonely and distant, kept at bay by the Covenant's magic. The barrier held strong as it had for 3 centuries, protecting all of us, human and vampire alike, from the darkness that lurked in the deep places of the world. And at the center of it all, a vampire healer and a human historian held hands, just as they had from the very beginning, bound by magic and by choice, by circumstance and by love. The future stretched ahead of us, vast and unknown, full of challenges and adventures yet to come. But whatever that future held, we'd face it together. 2 beings from different worlds who'd found in each other something precious, something worth holding on to. Forever.